You're listening to Food Trucks in Babylon, a Western Seminary podcast with Dr. Todd Miles and Dr. Patrick Schreiner. Listen as they discuss matters of faith, theology, and culture in a post-Christian world.
Hey, this is Patrick.
And this is Todd.
And today we have the privilege of having Jamie Smith with us. You're in town speaking to pastors in the area, and you teach at Calvin University. How long have you been there?
17 years.
17 years.
Oh, my gosh.
Wow.
Yes, it's been a long time.
That's great.
It's been good for me, though.
That's how long I've been at Western.
Is that right?
It feels weird. 17 years.
I know, right? It means we're old.
Yeah, I hate that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm on year 6 here. So
Yeah.
Shut up.
I'll catch up with you guys at some point.
But well, just listen, grasshopper. Maybe we'll show you the way.
Well, I appreciate you coming because I don't think I've been reading your work from the beginning, but I read your trilogy. I even got the box, the special box.
Oh, I love the box.
I got the box.
With William Morris tapestries all over it.
Nice.
So I'm that nerdy. And then I read
Thank you.
You Are What You Love. Great
Thanks.
book. All those books really formative for me. How Not to Be Secular. Read that one.
Yes.
That's a
Thank
great
you.
book as well.
Oh, that's great.
So
Yeah,
really-
that has come up a lot since I've been here in Portland, which
Yeah.
makes a ton of sense. I almost dreamed of people in Seattle and Portland and LA as I was writing that book. So that's encouraging.
it's perfect for us.
There are so many people I know
Yeah.
who say, man, I'm going to try to slug through Charles Taylor. I'm
Yeah.
just going to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'd read the Jamie Smith book.
It's a gateway drug. But yeah, it is amazing
Yeah.
to me how many pastors have been willing to then dive into the big book. So
That's great.
yeah, I'm happy to be a portal.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know some of our profs require, I think, Desiring the Kingdom for some of their anthropology systematic
fantastic.
classes. Do you do that?
Oh,
Okay.
do.
Great.
that's great. Thanks
Yeah.
so much.
So
Yeah.
we're just
encouraging.
really appreciative of your work.
No, wonderful. Glad to be here. I've heard
Yeah.
about Western Seminary for years, but have never been on campus.
Now
It's
you're
a
in the
treat to visit.
corner of the chapel in the most wonderful place of all.
Yes, absolutely. Behind the curtain.
Behind, literally.
And
Yeah.
well, your new book is On the Road with Saint Augustine.
Let's
Oh,
say
yeah,
it the way Jesus said it.
All right.
I paused there on purpose, and I remember reading an article that it is Augustine.
Oh, there's an actual article out there?
There's an
makes the
article
case?
somewhere. I think I read it at
Interesting.
some point.
And their argument was based on the Latin. This is the way it would have gone.
I think
Okay.
actually
Augustus.
Justin Taylor from Gospel Coalition did something on it.
Interesting.
And I saw his tweet thread, and I was always wondering, how do
Yeah.
you pronounce it?
Yeah.
I did my PhD at Villanova University, which is an Augustinian Catholic university. Like, it's run by the Augustinian order. And so hanging around with all the Augustinian monks and priests there, I realized they all said Augustine.
So that was
So
it.
I figured I should say Augustine.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, what does it actually say about a person when they say Augustine or whether they say Augustine?
I try not to judge.
Yeah.
So
Because I have a
it
feeling.
is
Try not to-
oftentimes.
Are you successful in not judging? Or
What's the look on my face?
Oh,
right
that's right. You Philistine.
No, I do. I think maybe historically it's also been a little bit of a Protestant Catholic distinction. In other words, I think Protestants have tended to say Augustine over the years.
Okay.
I have no idea why. Maybe it's also
So you place them-
particularly Americans who default
Yeah.
because we have obviously St. Augustine.
Yeah.
If you checked in at the airport and said, I'm going to St. Augustine, Florida, that you would have to repeat.
That's
it
That's a good
10
point,
times, right?
Yeah.
So,
that
Yeah,
would
yeah.
make no sense because
Yeah.
that's not a place.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the road with St. Augustine.
Nice.
Nice. So what led you to write this book in this way? Traveling with him. It's a unique kind of way of introducing us to some of his thoughts on different topics, and you use kind of this mapping, traveling, geography of desire.
Yeah, it's got a really cool table of contents.
Yeah.
Just the
Yeah.
way it's set
I'm
on
glad
the
you
page.
like it. That was totally my idea.
Are you kidding?
I just want
Seriously?
that to be clear right now. That was my idea.
And the publisher bought it.
Yes,
Nice.
I've been very grateful. My publisher Brazos has been. I live down the street from it, and they have
That's
let
right.
me have untold influence on design and cover stuff.
Wow.
And so yeah, that was a dream I came up with to sort of give a feel for it, so readers or listeners know that. The table of contents is set out like a map with way
yeah.
stations on the way. And the whole on the road metaphor, I mean, there's kind of different braids of influence on that. So the one is the journey metaphor is all over Augustine's corpus, not just his published treatises, but his sermons as well. It's this human sense of the pilgrimage, the quest, the journey is something Augustine sees that as kind of built into the human heart, and he thinks the scriptures often speak to that human longing for journey, travel, pilgrimage,
the way,
exactly, the way.
Yeah.
The other is, of course, that for Augustine, really the framework and template of the Confessions, his Confessions, is the travel of the prodigal son. So the Confessions are, the skeleton framework of the Confessions is sort of organized around that road trip that the prodigal son takes. So that's another layer. But then the title On the Road is not accidental. It's a very, very direct allusion to Kerouac. And it just strikes me that in our current cultural moment, really as heirs of the 20th century, that whole notion of being on the road is life, joy in the journey, embrace the journey, that's still alive and well in a spiritual but not religious culture. And so I thought this was another way to frame really the perennial and contemporary relevance of Augustine for our current cultural hunger.
Yeah, because I'm not certain that people would have thought that Augustine would speak so profoundly to existentialist and postmodern philosophers.
Right. And yet, once you dig under the surface, it actually turns out he influenced existentialists and postmodern philosophers.
Yeah, which I had no idea.
Yeah. So that was part of what jazzed me about. I don't know. I'm a little bit worried that sometimes there's two books crammed into one here. But part of the backstory is how much direct influence Augustine has on those existentialist templates of finding yourself in Heidegger, in Camus, in Derrida, it's Lyotard, in Foucault reads Augustine. Wow. So it's just intriguing how often there is a direct encounter with Augustine in the philosophical movements that then trickle down into the cultural water today.
And yet clearly Augustine ends up in a different place than these guys do.
Yeah, so it's almost like we inherit Augustine's quest and questions, but have resisted his hope and destination. Yeah. Although part of the wager of the book is whether we are reaching a moment of exhaustion of those secular paradigms where people might even be willing to consider that destination, that quote unquote answer, so to speak.
Yeah. All of your work, I think, we kind of mentioned it, really speaks into the culture we're living in terms of that journey and the way and kind of people trying to figure out spirituality and where we're going, meaning of life. Just basic big questions that people have as kind of modernism has started to crumble. People are having more real existential questions about some of the things you address, freedom, evil, things like that.
Yeah, I think so, right? That's part of the wager of the book is that this is the first book I've written very intentionally with a possible non-believing audience in mind.
Okay. Yeah.
Whether we'll find that audience or not, I'm not sure. But the book does not assume that you're already on the road with Augustine.
Yeah.
The book assumes that you might be the kind of person who's been exhausted by all the alternatives. And here's a guy who tried everything that you tried.
Right.
And maybe because of your exhaustion, you might be willing to entertain where he ended up journeying. So I do think mostly my take on our cultural moment, however we want to call it, a secular age, whatever it might be. I don't think a secular age is flat, right? So I think we're always on the move in that regard. I'm mostly hopeful rather than fearful about the opportunities for mission and openness. I see lots of cracks in the secular, so to speak, where, yes, I know there's Richard Dawkinses on the horizon who are shouting so loudly, but in some ways I think that's almost the last gasp of a secular modernity that knows its days might be numbered, or it's not convincing the people. It's not been the great win that they expected. And the very fact that people want to say they're spiritual but not religious, they say that rather than proudly proclaiming their naturalism or something. I think says something about human hungers.
Okay. Right. Have you read some of Mark Sayers' stuff? Australian sociology. He's saying some of the similar things.
Absolutely. In fact,
tide's going out and it's going to come back in. People are going to realize there's emptiness. They're trying to find individuality and meaning, but they're realizing, people are coming to this kind of, you find meaning within community, and some of the things even you address in the book, and structure, so forth and so on.
Interestingly, Mark also has a book on Kerouac.
Oh, he does?
He calls Kerouac's novel The Road Trip That Changed the World, which I think is very suggestive. Yeah. And I think that's right. And the question is the church ready to be a community to actually welcome people into an alternative? Or have we already kind of sold our soul for a mess of pottage of cultural relevance, which just turns out to be a Jesusified version of what modernity is, in which case we don't really have much of an alternative to offer. I think that's if I'm worried, it's less about external threat and internal, it's more about internal ecclesial failure. You know?
It's like the church would welcome all these people who are searching for answers, and we just hold up a mirror and say, here's the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Or we imagine that, we have a great slate of programs for you. Here's, and we've got a podcast. Or podcasts are great, but there's, in other words, we imagine that if we could just convince them of the right set of ideas, and they would believe, like we come to them with an answer when what they're looking for is a way, and a people to be part of on the way, and that people is the body of Christ. And the question is, are we really ready and willing to be the community of friendship that they're hungering for? I don't know. Is the church the place you go looking for authentic community? Right. I think it's an open question in that regard.
Yeah. This has nothing to do with The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
No, it's good, which is also, one of my favorite.
Be a very depressing book.
It would be, The Road by Cormac McCarthy shows up in Desiring the Kingdom a couple times, actually.
Oh, does it?
Because what's interesting is, even in that decimated post-apocalyptic wasteland, what do people do? They still forge rituals. Right. There's still litanies and liturgies that they need to survive. And it's not an accident for McCarthy, whose Catholic upbringing shows up.
Yeah. Well, you speak about conversion in this book, and we've kind of been hitting on it. You say it's not a solution, rather it changes how you travel. It gives you a compass. Why do you think that's so important to understand? I know we've been hitting around that, but I really appreciate that language. I think especially kind of in Christian cultures, we viewed conversion as this moment and you're set. But rather you said, no, that's just kind of the beginning of the journey.
Yeah. This is part of what I call Augustine's spiritual realism. Christianity is not a solution. It's not a fix. It's certainly not a promise that you will live your best life now. Do you know what I mean? Like that kind of, and I think it is so spiritually destructive for people to be told that would be the case, because then it so messes them up when it turns out that that's not true. And therefore they either question the gospel or question whether they're in Christ. Whereas someone like Augustine comes along and says, no, okay, wait. Conversion, baptism is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not even necessarily going to just eviscerate all your restlessness. It will just change how you are restless, because now it's the restlessness of, it's not because you don't know where home is, that you've been welcomed into the Father who's welcoming you home. But there's still the kind of sanctified impatience of not being there yet. Right, and it's just recognizing there are many miles to go before we sleep. I think having an eyes wide open account of the difficulties and struggle and challenge of the Christian life is more of a liberating gift than the sort of de facto pseudo prosperity gospels of whatever stripe, which all functionally tell you, if you do X, Y will be better for you. They're all forms of moralism. They're all forms of really a kind of spiritual self-help, and that's not the gospel, it seems to me.
God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Yeah. I mean, that's a form of prosperity, right?
Absolutely. There are so many forms of prosperity gospel. Do you know what I mean? Like there's Paula White, gag me with a spoon, just like heinous blasphemy.
but there's
And
tame
there's all
versions of it.
But there's
Yeah.
Yeah, there
tame
is.
versions of it which we
Right.
just call
Yeah.
suburban
Yeah.
evangelicalism.
Right. Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, and what happens is we hold out this picture and say, if you become a Christian, you too can have a nice, comfortable minivan suburban life.
Right. Right.
And you'll get, things will go well for your family.
Yeah.
And it's just not true. Augustine
Yeah.
keeps looking back to, he says, you want to know what the Christian life is like? Look at Israel,
Right.
wandering deserts. and
Yeah.
he says, that's a bit what it feels like.
Yeah.
We're still waiting to cross the Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe another way of saying it is, for Augustine, eschatology is an integral part of the spiritual life. Okay. And if you have a proper eschatology, then you have to temper your expectations of just what exactly it looks like and feels like to be in Christ. That's not to say that you're not secure, not that you're not resting, but it also just doesn't come with any illusions about ease.
Yeah. Right.
So you're on a path, you're on a road, you're not home.
Yeah.
yet.
Exactly. I
You're
mean,
not home.
the difference is, so you got, conversion is the acquisition of the compass, so to speak. So
Yeah.
now you know
Yeah.
where north is.
Right. Right.
And now you know where home is. And I guess let's not underestimate, and you are not alone
Right.
Okay.
on
Good.
the way.
Right.
So Christ, who will never leave you nor forsake you, is journeying with us. In fact, sometimes the metaphor Augustine uses is the only reason we're on the way is because God in his grace sent a raft that is shaped like a cross, on which is Christ, that we now are floating on towards home.
Right.
And he's
But
already made the journey.
He's made the journey.
He's
So
been
it's
there and
all
back
God's
again.
initiative. Exactly.
Right.
So the other road trip is the canonic one of Philippians chapter 2.
Okay, yes.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's
Yep,
the other
yep.
another sort of map of a road trip. And
Yep.
now what happens is Christ, who has ascended, lifts us up
Yeah.
and is journeying with us and gives us the people of God. So it's a deeply communal vision of what the Christian life looks like. But there is this sense of already not yet. It's just put
Right,
cliche, but it's
Yeah.
taking that seriously.
And
Yeah.
the metaphor used in the book is this refugee notion.
Yeah.
which-
Refugee
which-
spirituality.
Which speaks
I like that.
profoundly to our
Yep.
sensibilities right now, because
Yep.
we're hypersensitive to
Yes.
what it is to be a refugee.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Or at least we ought to be.
We ought to be, and many who have actually experienced that would then resonate with, right? So when Augustine says that we are, the Latin term is peregrinus, often translated pilgrim,
Okay.
but some recent scholarship has shown that in the sense you might better translate that more like emigre or refugee, because it's not always about a return journey, right? Sometimes it's about going somewhere that you've never been. A refugee is somebody who finds a homeland they've never been to. And
Yeah.
why is it like, why is the Christian life like that refugee kind of experience? Well, on the one hand, we are all longing for a home that we've never been to. So it's not just a return journey in a sense, but it's also because the refugee's experience is fraught and tenuous and harrowing at times. And Augustine thinks that's part of what the spiritual life is like.
Yeah.
And he owns that,
Yeah. Is this what you mean? So I was struck by your language. Exile is the kingdom, and I've never thought of it that way. I've always thought.
Well, no. So that's
is that different?
Camus.
Okay.
So you're right. So part of
I was like, wait a
that's,
second.
That's in a
Aren't we trying to
discussion of Albert Camus, right? So and what Camus does, what Camus represents, is kind of like the Kerouac philosophy, which says the road is life. So I think maybe the default option of a secularized worldview is to say we're on a journey, but actually we don't think we ever arrive anywhere.
Right.
So then what you do is you try to talk yourself into saying the road is life,
Yeah,
or
gotcha.
what Camus is saying is in the myth of Sisyphus, exile is kingdom. You sort of embrace that reality. And what I'm suggesting is I don't think that does justice to the human hunger for home.
Right.
It's trying to talk yourself
Yep.
out of the human hunger for home. Whereas what Augustine will say is, I think Augustine can both honor what we feel as the exilic experience, but would also say that's not normative it's the experience of the journey on the way, and it's not accidental and it's not illegitimate that we are longing for a home, and that's what's offered to us in the gospel, in God's grace.
So it's more like, say, the exiles in Babylon who were born in Babylon had never been to Jerusalem, but they know that it's there.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Right.
exactly. Another way of putting it is, for Augustine, the prodigal son is kind of the parable of the human condition. The difference is we are all already born on the run.
Okay.
We've, you're born having left, having grabbed the gifts, refused the giver, said, "I wish you were dead" to the Father, and now the question is, can you get home to the place you've never been, but is nonetheless what you're made for?
Did you think about doing a chapter on home?
I thought about it.
Because it kind of feels like the journey's going towards like a place.
Yes,
you know?
yeah. So the epilogue is the homecoming, which is, it's almost like there are degrees of homecoming, Augustine, right? So I don't want to underestimate the way in which to be in Christ is to know who one is and where you're made for and what your hope is, right? That's the acquisition of a compass, and it's a hope that does not disappoint. But then there's still this sense of the meantime of our waiting. How long, O Lord? And the songs we sing on the way, and that's dealing with the impatience of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to jump into some of these topics that you covered as we go on the road.
Hi, my name is Eric, and I'm in the MDiv program at Western Seminary. My favorite part about studying here is being able to develop those close relationships with fellow students in and outside of the classroom while discovering how I can love God with my whole life. I also really appreciate that my professors care about what I'm learning alongside my personal spiritual formation. Western Seminary offers a number of programs to help students prepare for the work God has called them to do through rigorous education designed with practical application. If you are interested in learning more about Western or starting your application, visit us online at westernseminary.edu. Now, back to the show.
Okay, we're back with Jamie Smith, and this is Food Trucks in Babylon. And so the question we ask, favorite food trucks or favorite food? Have you been able to check out the food truck scene in Portland?
Not on this trip. I have before that.
Okay.
That little square downtown where there's the food trucks.
Yeah,
is,
It was like
Which is probably
50
going
minutes
away,
big.
unfortunately.
is that right?
They're going to build a high-rise
shoot.
hotel there. I know. It's
yeah,
so
it is
sad.
pretty prime real estate. I could see
It
how that
is,
would go.
Yeah, everyone's really upset about it in Portland.
We
Obviously.
have one of my favorite food trucks is back in Grand Rapids. Saturday mornings we go to the farmers market. That's our sort of go-to rhythm and pattern. It's just one of our favorite places in the world, one of our favorite rituals. And one of our local food trucks that shows up there does great sort of breakfast tacos and breakfast burritos. It's called What the Truck. It's actually it's out of one of our favorite restaurants, which is right down the street from our house, called the Winchester. So yeah, it's quite fun.
That's funny.
Nice.
We
So
have go
if
ahead.
you're in Michigan, check out what
the truck. Yes. Yes.
This isn't as funny, but we have a Mexican restaurant right down the road called Porque No, Why Not, which is pretty good as well. So.
Yeah. But that's a brick and mortar, but it's very, very
It is.
good.
Yeah,
It's not a food
great.
truck. So let's get into some of these topics that Augustine helps us with. Freedom. You start with freedom. And I love the Lady Bird example, mainly because I love that movie, and I thought you put it together really well.
Great.
You're free to talk about that, but maybe talk about what does liberation look like for Augustine? What does freedom mean for Augustine? I think this is huge for our society and understanding what it looks like to be free.
It might almost be the most fundamental question in a sense,
Right.
because it might be the question on which Augustine will most upend our thinking, but also most directly speaks to something that's in the water of our culture. So for Augustine, most of what we call freedom in late modernity is not liberating. It's enchaining, because what he thinks is we have confused freedom with mere freedom of choice. So we think we are free if we remove constraints, if we throw off the shackles of any imposition on our own autonomy. So we just identify freedom with autonomy and independence, and I am free just to the extent that I can multiply my choices and do whatever I want. So what that means, though, for Augustine is there's actually no direction for me. There's no substantive vision of the good. So now the burden is entirely on me to basically make up my own good, or as we put it, you do you. And I really do think that. Well, and so let me add one more layer of analysis to that. Augustine also thinks that is a recipe for becoming enslaved to your own passions, which then take on a force of habit, which before you know it becomes a necessity. And now all of a sudden what started as freedom ends up as addiction.
Yeah, right.
So that so much of what we think of as celebrating as freedom slides towards this addiction, where now it looked like I was the master of myself and I was choosing what I wanted. But by the end of it, I'm enslaved to something else and it's mastering me.
Yeah. It's like the story of sin, just very clearly.
Totally.
Right? You choose it. You think you're free to choose it. I have freedom to do this. This is going to bring me happiness. And then suddenly you find yourself enslaved to something you no longer even want.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you don't even want it. No, that's right.
You keep doing it.
That's right. Because now you can't not. It's a necessity.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why in the book, there's a kind of constant companion I keep referring to. It's a remarkable book by Leslie Jameson, who's
I saw that
great
come up
writer.
again. I was like, I should read this book.
Yeah, it's called The Recovering, and it's her insider account of what it's like to come through addiction and recovery, and it's a really powerful parallel to what Augustine's talking about. I do think we're reaching a cultural moment where also people are realizing it's exhausting to make this up. Do you know what I mean? Like it's exhausting to be told you can be whatever you want and you can make up your own version of the good. And I think we see more and more young people saying, please tell me what I mean, I think this partly explains the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, of whom I'm not a fan. But I think part of what's going on is like you have a bunch of young men who are saying, can somebody please just tell me what to do?
right.
And so Jordan Peterson's happy to be your daddy and tell you what to do. I think people what are they looking for? They're looking for a directedness. Yeah. Tell me how to be human. Give me a substantive vision of the good. So for Augustine, true freedom isn't just the multiplication of freedom of choice. True freedom is an empowerment for my good. Yeah. And that's why he thinks true freedom receives the gift of good constraints. Mm-hmm. That one of the graces in our lives is actually the grace of people giving us guardrails, not to control us, but to channel us to what is our own flourishing and good.
Right.
And I think, again, I see a lot of people curious about that option. Yeah. At the same time that we want to do whatever we want. I mean, we're conflicted.
Yeah.
But
you don't want to be told what to do.
I think we might be surprised how many people are looking for the gift of good guardrails. And that's another reason why I just think there's coming a really interesting cultural moment to bear witness to how to be human again that the gospel speaks to. And I think Augustine's account of freedom is part of that.
Yeah.
And of course we see that in parenting, right? With our kids. Yeah. You give them just total freedom. It's almost paralyzing. But if you put some boundaries, there's like a relief.
Yes. Yes. I worked for when my kids were younger. I helped with. We had a ministry in the Christian Reformed Church called Cadets, which is basically just Calvinist. Boy Scouts. It's like Boy Scouts. All right. But and we would then also, it included a lot of neighborhood kids who weren't from the church, and many of whom came from homes that just did not give them any guardrails at all. And it was interesting. You could just see. They actually soaked, even at the same time that they were bristling against it, they were also sort of soaking up someone taking enough interest to tell them what not to do, or to just channel their energies and interests. And I think that's right. Now for Augustine, it's really important that this isn't a form of authoritarianism, right? It's not giving license for people to take away my agency.
Right.
For Augustine, true freedom is the grace that gives me back my agency to be and make the choices that I should be making.
Right.
So
Right.
it's a dance in that regard.
Yeah, I'm reading David
ahead.
Brooks's book, The Second Mountain. He's talking about graduation speeches. You can be whoever you want to be. And he's like, people are crippled. They're like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I have this degree and I'm just supposed to go do whatever I want to do. And he's just touching on that exact point as people walk out of college. So,
by the way, Augustine was a big part of David's journey too.
Oh, okay.
So
Nice.
when you,
Nice.
if you go back to the Road to Character and look at the Augustine chapter,
Yes.
you can basically see
interesting.
all the seeds
Yeah.
of the Second Mountain
Nice.
already anticipated.
I just listened to that, and it seems like
that whole book.
I just listened to
Oh,
the
nice.
whole book. Yeah, and
You're ahead of me.
with Augustine, and pretty detailed theology that he goes into. He's clearly not. It didn't seem like he was some outsider.
No,
that
no,
was
no,
just
no,
Speaking
no.
about Augustine, the
No.
way he
Right.
spoke about some of
Absolutely.
the other people
Absolutely.
in that. So our contemporary world, it doesn't want to give these guardrails. Talks about freedom. You have a chapter on friendship and about how there's this quest for authenticity. Our culture will say, hey, the fail-safe path to actualization is to be authentic. But then you write that there's a strong link between loneliness and this recipe for authenticity that our culture prescribes or gives us. How does Augustine speak to that?
Yeah, so I think the connection is that on the one hand, our culture has told us, be authentic, be you. You have to determine who you're supposed to be. So the burden of that comes with this recipe of autonomy. But the price of autonomy is also creating an island where you are the only master, right? And so what happens is any influence of other people is seen as a kind of threat to my autonomy,
Yes.
right? So I almost have this burden of having to be absolutely and utterly novel, which means then that I am utterly alone in the ability to try to make up who I'm supposed to be. So that by nature creates this way of being alongside other people that effectively says, I have to kind of resist you at the same time I'm trying to show you how unique and novel and special I am. And I think that's the recipe for actually sort of creating this buffered self, as Charles Taylor calls it, actually, right? We think it's granting us autonomy, but it's also building us into our own little cells. And it's not a surprise then that we end up with this epidemic of social isolation and loneliness. I mean, I do think some of that is also because of family breakdown and all kinds of social erosions. But there's another part of it in which we live in this culture of authenticity where I'm supposed to display what you're going to like and follow and thumbs up and whatever. But if that's not the real me, now the real me that I don't think I could ever show you and you would still like me, is now incredibly lonely behind the screen of mutual display. And I think that's a profound situation of isolation. And what Augustine is saying is, well, the trick here is stop thinking about other people. Hell is not other people. Augustine says, I couldn't be happy without friends. So what happens is, in that disordered form of it, we basically have a lot of companions, but hardly any friends. We almost don't know how to be friends anymore. Whereas Augustine is talking about what does authentic friendship look like? Well, it means you have to drop that sort of buffered version of yourself, open up the pores, so to speak. Taylor talks about the porous self. That's risky.
Yeah.
You're vulnerable, but it's also the only way that you can actually have genuine community and friendship. And so Augustine thinks that's how we reach fullness. We're made to be in community.
Yeah, that's helpful. You write about ambition and pastors, professors. I think a lot of people who listen to this will be pastors who are in a church, or professors maybe. A lot of people who listen to this will probably be in the public eye in some sense. And ambition is one of those tricky things, because if you're up in front of people, I speak as a professor and a pastor, you want to be affirmed.
Yeah.
That's just the part of what it is, right? And
you can't do it without drawing attention to yourself.
Exactly.
Like you literally could not fulfill your office
Yep.
without drawing attention to yourself.
Right. So you're in the similar situation. You're a public speaker,
And professor.
writing.
Yeah.
How did this chapter and on ambition affect you, like personally?
Yeah. If I was really honest, I would tell you how it still affected me. Because anybody who writes a book also wants people to buy it. And wants people to and wants reviews and wants it to make a difference. Anybody who tells you they're writing a book but they don't care if it influences is lying.
Right. Yeah.
Like it's just crazy.
You're about to get to my
just
books.
go stay to your solipsistic self and why on earth would you write a book if you weren't trying to influence people?
Right.
So I think what I love about Augustine is he's honest. By the way, he doesn't demonize ambition. Mm-hmm. I don't think we should ever demonize ambition.
Yeah.
I think ambition can be holy. It's what are we ambitious for and what are we looking for when we're looking for influence? If I'm trying to satisfy an ultimate hunger with penultimate influence, right? If I'm trying to satisfy what is an infinite desire for meaning and significance by how many followers I have or how many books I sell or how many people come to my lecture, that's a bad recipe, right? Because now I'm looking for ultimate fulfillment in finite goods that are doomed to disappoint me. And so Augustine in Book 10 of the Confessions, he writes this when he's a bishop.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just recount his past sins, he recounts his current sins. Mm-hmm. And he says, actually, the one temptation that he is most prone to still fall into is worldly ambition, to do things for the praise of men, for the adulation. And so he says, okay, given that that's my most significant temptation, maybe I should just avoid the problem and not be public. Right? Because that would be one way. If I just hide,
that would be one way.
Then but then, of course, he's saying, well, that's Jonah. Or that's a Jonah-like evasion of my calling. Yeah. And that's actually a kind of an easy,
you're not actually dealing with the issue.
No.
You're not dealing just avoiding it.
Yeah. You're not actually living into it. So what Augustine says is, I'm still called to exercise this office, and what I need to do is keep seeking the grace to know that I'm doing it for God's sake and not my own. Mm-hmm. But here's the most liberating part, I think, for Augustine. If you ask Augustine, are you doing this for God or for Augustine? His answer is yes. Right. It's both. Yeah. And I don't know how you guys feel. That to me is like did you write this book to serve the kingdom?
What it is.
It's hopeful. It really is hopeful. And it's liberating because it's honest. Yep. And that God already knows that. Do you know what I mean? God honestly knows. And so to just voice it and confess it, I do think confession is a really, really important practice, right? It's a discipline in which I say, you know what? Yes, I want to serve the greater good of the kingdom. God, I have to confess how many times I looked at my Amazon rank or something. Do you know what I mean? Whatever it is. And to be honest about that and say, deliver me, but also it may be a long time coming, right? And it's just sort of I think this particular temptation, Augustine realizes is the sort of constant companion shadow side of callings that have a public office. Mm-hmm. And you don't evade it by evading the office. You just live into the messiness of that, knowing the priority of God's grace and the importance of confession. And I don't know. I find that encouraging and hopeful, as you say, and liberating.
Yeah.
Because the path is sanctification. The destination is glorification.
Yes, right. That's well put. Yeah. That's very helpful, actually.
So when mapping out and keeping that metaphor, mapping out your heart on this, our hearts, do you pay attention to your emotions when you're not receiving praise or when you get a terrible review? And is that kind of, is that what how you're tracking?
Yeah.
How is a hypothetical question.
Yeah. No.
I've never had a terrible review.
It's funny how, my wife Deanna and I had actually a long conversation with this last night because, I think you guys also know the experience too of just the postpartum that sets in after you publish a book. Mm-hmm. right? So it's
Yeah.
just it's just a recipe for disaster, basically.
Yeah.
And then I'm
Goes from
at
the
a
greatest
stage,
thing ever to the worst thing ever.
Yes,
basically.
exactly.
That's the two poles.
Yes.
You're never in the middle.
No. And I'm also, with this book, I've kind of reached a bit of a pivot point in my career, only because I think with Desiring the Kingdom, there was sort of a trajectory and thread that you could follow. And in many ways, I think On the Road with St. Augustine is the culmination of that project. And so now I'm also in this, I've never in my professional career been without a book contract, but I've intentionally not signed anything. As
You
I
shouldn't have
was
said that
working
out
on this.
loud, because now publishers are going to
No, I doubt that's true. But I've intentionally not, because I honestly don't know what I'm called to in the next phase.
Gotcha.
But the struggle is, the temptation is to write what you think will do X, Y, and Z, or I want to write what I want to write, but I'm trying to discern, what does God want me to write? And I don't mean to sound, I'm not given to being overly pious, but I genuinely want to know, what's the next decade, what's the next project for the next decade? And I find myself in a very discombobulated space that I don't like very much, but I'm trying to sort of rest into it. And my wife is the one who really helps me attend to my emotions, as you put it. And it's really, you know, you think about good guardrails. I do just have to testify that in my life, marriage has been the most significant graced guardrail for me.
Right.
And to journey together with that, with a spouse and partner who will speak into that with courage, has been a great gift.
Yeah, that's helpful.
That is.
I really liked your chapter on story, and I started thinking about how theologians write, because you talk about the rationalization of faith, some themes that I think you've brought up in your other writings, but just the structure of the confessions. You make the argument there that he's trying to kind of pull on your heartstrings, stir your imagination.
Yeah. Not just structure. I mean, actual sort of rhetoric.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. Do you think theologians and more people need to write in that way? Like, how does that affect how you
if
write?
I had a dream,
and I'd like to get to preaching too.
I think the best preachers already get this, and it's probably precisely because Augustine was a preacher,
right?
And remember, he was a professional rhetor before that. He gets how this works. But I mean, I hope people might feel like in writing this book, I was also trying to engage in a craft of writing that's meeting people on a different register than the didactic.
Yeah, right.
And that's a craft. Like, I have a deep sense of how much apprenticing I have to do to actually lean into that. But there are, I think this is part of what I'm struggling with right now too, is I think I have an inkling of a genre of theological writing that doesn't quite exist yet, or is not very widespread, that it just seems to me we should be able to pull off. But it would require the same people who have apprenticed themselves to the theological tradition, I mean the rigors of the academic and intellectual tradition,
right,
to then equally apprentice themselves to the craft of writing by reading poets and novelists. And that's what I've been trying to, I've tried to live into those two spaces. I haven't been professionally formed. I'm just walking alongside poets and novelists. And I just feel like to me, it's a travesty for the gospel to be boring. And it is a travesty for theology to make it sound like the kingdom of God is a dreary lecture. And I just feel like there's
sounds like my book I'm going to give him.
I was going to say it sounds like it sounds like most of the plenary addresses at ETS that I've heard.
And I mean, I don't want to fault anybody, because we've all been.
There is a place for didactic, systematic.
Yes.
And I don't think you're not saying that. But if anything, we've fallen off on one side where it's just straight teaching. I mean, the best theological books are well written. I mean, everyone admits that.
Yes.
You look at something. I just keep on seeing Michael Reeves delighting in the Trinity, and it's a very theological book. But man, he wrote that to just stir your heart.
Yeah, no,
and you
beautiful.
read that, and it's. I don't know. Have you picked that book?
I
up?
have not. No, I'm a philosopher, so I don't do the Trinity. But
anything by Michael Bird, who's funny. I laugh out loud reading his.
That's great.
Theology.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of one of my templates that I was working on was Merton's 7-Story Mountain. I do think in Catholic traditions there's more range in this regard, but I think there's such a paucity and gap in more accessible, popular writing for the church. And I think that's especially where we need to be creative, because otherwise just people, the vacuum gets filled with garbage, and that's what frustrates me.
Do you have a specific genre in mind, or are you just saying that genre exists that we haven't created yet? You said something about...
I don't know what it is, but I feel like... Now, on the one hand, I also think one of the greatest theology books of the last 30 years was Marilyn Robinson's Gilead.
Right.
You know, so I'm not talking... I'm just wondering if there's a kind of genre that, in a sense... maybe it does exist, but we haven't named it as a genre yet, but where this intersection of creative nonfiction and theological reflection meets.
Right.
And is both engaging people intellectually and affectively.
Right.
And is not, its primary purpose isn't instruction, even though you would also learn something from it. I think that's the way the Confessions work. You know, you're not really supposed to read the Confessions to learn something about Augustine.
Right.
You're supposed to read the Confessions to be prompted to encounter the God that Augustine encountered.
Yeah.
And so it functions differently.
Well, it's not like
regard.
an autobiography.
Exactly.
I think you mentioned that in the book.
Exactly.
I just think it's helpful. You said the best pastors do that, but, you know, we're in a seminary environment. When people step out, I think the tendency is deliver like these nuggets of truth. And once you've done that, if it's true, then you're done.
Right.
You know?
Right. There's a lot of work to be done
that.
on, or there has been, of course, on narrative preaching. I'll say one plug for preachers. My friend and colleague Neil Planiga, Cornelius Planiga, has a marvelous little book called Reading for Preaching. Tiny little book. But basically what it is it's a curriculum for getting pastors and preachers to apprentice themselves to poets, novelists, creative nonfiction, really good journalists like Orwell and Camus and things like that.
Right.
Just not for the illustrations, but to learn how to use language.
Right.
And it's actually one of the reasons, one of my dreams too, I'm the editor-in-chief of Image Journal, which is a journal of faith in the arts, where we publish poetry and literature, short stories, creative nonfiction. One of my dreams is actually that more and more pastors would subscribe to that as a way of apprenticing their tongues to the cadences of poetry, which of course is a lot of the Bible. And meets people on a different register in that regard.
Yeah, that's good. Can we talk about your chapter on justice? I found that really helpful, and I feel like you might get some pushback on that chapter. I don't know.
Interesting.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
So you contrast an atheism of comfort with an atheism of agony. There's one of defiance and one of despair, and you say, well, the second one of agony, of despair, is more respectable. Because the goal here is not to maybe answer the problem of evil,
or explain
it, right?
Right.
So what in Augustine led you to
think of
that?
it this way. Is it Psalm 14? The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. There's very different ways to imagine how somebody reached that conclusion, right? The one is the sort of Richard Dawkins defiance of I'm more enlightened. The other that I refer to, of course, is the Ta-Nehisi Coates experience of how can there be a God if this has been the experience of my people?
Yep.
And an atheism, a refusal, an inability to believe that is born of suffering is so understandable to me. Do you mean I get the plausibility of that?
Right.
And in response to that, almost every version of theodicy is a travesty, right? Because it mostly is saying, here's how we're going to solve this intellectual puzzle.
Right.
It's exactly why, I do think a lot of Christian philosophies of theodicy fail because they actually have no articulation within them of the centrality of the cross. So I think the cross is the only possible way to think about articulating a response, not an answer, but a response to the problem of evil, that God takes on that evil. And so this is one of the places where I disagree with Augustine a little bit, or at least I'm less, sometimes he gets off in his philosophical flights of the greater good defense and, we need the dark to see the light. And I'm like, But then in his preaching, in his sermons is where you hear him go to the cross and meets people in their suffering. I mean, he's a pastor. He knows what it's like to walk through the tragedy with people. And so I just think there's a difference in posture that we have to do. I think, what is it? I think the character in Gilead, actually, in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, John Ames, right? At one point he says something like, nothing true of God has ever been said in defense. Now, that's hyperbole. It's hyperbole. But I get the point, which is if we are already on our back leg imagining that we have to defend God, we're probably engaged in the wrong project. Stop, what you two once saying, stop helping God across the street like a little old lady. And I think the lament psalms bear witness to how God can take our protest in that regard.
So you think, am I summarizing this right? You think kind of our answer to the problem of evil, trying to figure out free will, all this stuff,
which
we've just,
I don't want to say are illegitimate things to grapple with. You can't.
But maybe it's not the first step we should take.
No, and I think even all of that only makes sense if ultimately it culminates in a story in which the God of the cosmos takes on the sin we've made of it, the brokenness and tragedy we've made of it. It's also important to say, this is Paul Ricoeur, that, look, don't just have an answer for evil, respond to evil, undo the injustices. That's why this shows up in the justice chapter.
Right.
Because so much of the evil of the world is the evil we've made of the world. And that has then become embedded in systems and structures that we tend and maintain as part of the status quo. And that's where I think if Christians aren't opposed to that, then all of our quote-unquote theodicies and answers mean nothing.
Okay. Well, help us think through this then. If evil, not a problem to be solved, it's to be protested. You're right, it's to be overcome. But then we have other scriptures that say all things work together for good. Those who love the Lord are called according to his purpose. How does protest work with that reluctance then to try to explain or try to figure out now exactly how is God working all things for my good in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less figuring that out. Lament is only lament because it also ends in trust.
Yeah, hope of some
sort.
Hope,
right?
Hope of some sort, yeah.
But that hope is not the same as seeing the answer, it seems to me. Or figuring it out. It is an entrusting to the God who takes on the evil of the world, overcoming it. So there's a difference, it seems to me, in trusting the God who overcomes it. But now we're back to eschatology too. And it's
that
still
refugee
here.
spirituality.
Exactly.
Again. We're on the road. We're not at the destination.
Exactly. And we are called to, I mean, I do think in the meantime of our waiting, the church is called to try to bend the systems and structures of the world to reflect the shalom of the coming kingdom, if we can, in ways that are possible. And that's why responding to evil is also trying to undo it where we can. But I also think, there is one of the things that worries me about our cultural moment right now is people confuse anger with lament, and those aren't exact. Anger, lament includes anger, but it is also a posture of trust. You can only lament if you've already trusted the God that you're angry with.
Okay.
And I'm worried that we fetishize anger a little bit right now instead. And it's important to distinguish the two, it seems to me.
That's good. Yeah. Well, we've got to wrap up here, but maybe one final question. Just what do you hope people get from walking on the road with Augustine? Like, I know we've probably talked around a lot of the things, but like I know you said you wanted at the beginning, you'd love for non-Christians, non-believers to get this in their hands. Maybe I'm giving you your answer. This is what I do right now, but maybe some of it is teaching others how to speak to non-Christians in these ways, if just Christians pick it up. But anything else?
Sure. I would say, I mean, one really sincere hope is that if somebody who's not on the way could encounter somebody of Augustine's intellect and vivacity, could all of a sudden imagine how they could join the way of Jesus when they couldn't have imagined it before. I would say that's one hope. The other is, I guess I really do hope that maybe for Christians, they will find an ancient friend that just sort of kind of expands their scope of what they think Christianity could look and feel like. And that's where I think the spiritual realism piece comes on. But if it also was the beginning of people realizing that they are part of a people of God that is ancient, and that here is a brother that they walk alongside in a way, I that would encourage me, because it would mean that we've expanded the purview of where we think God's at work.
That's helpful. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's been great.
It.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hey, this is Todd. We have received a lot of good feedback on this podcast. We have also received some questions. You have been emailing them to us, and we want to encourage you to consider that.
That's right. So we plan on doing an episode where we just answer questions. So we'd love to have you send those things in to podcast@westernseminary.edu, podcast singular at westernseminary.edu. And Todd, how can they send those questions?
Well, you can either type them out in the email, but what would be even better is if you created an audio file asking the question and send that to us.
Right, we need to keep that at 20 seconds and we'll play it. And so send in. We'd love to hear the audio clip of your voice. We'd play it and then we'd answer the question as best we can. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Food Trucks in Babylon. The music you hear is provided by our friends at Humble Beast Records. If you like the show, please leave us a review and feel free to subscribe. To learn more about Western Seminary, visit us at westernseminary.edu.